Hey everyone, this is Will from Beijing, China, and welcome to this new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. As you know that cities across China today are still dealing with the pandemic, but meanwhile, some people say this pandemic is just about fighting another battle regarding the illness or regarding this unprecedented global crisis. But take a look deeper. Some people believe that this pandemic actually helps us to understand something that we have never encountered before, which is personality, individual growth, and the way how we're supposed to understand ourselves better. You know, too often when we hear about the word crisis, and internationally speaking, we're looking at the wars, looking at the conflicts, politically and socially and economically. But in this episode, we need to put all these politics on the side because it's important that we need to see the word crisis and understand how to manage the crisis within ourselves and also the issues surround us, take a more approachable and much more tangible way. So that's why today it's my great honor to invite two distinguished guests to help us understand during the crisis, how should we respond positively? And also, what is the effective communication in the midst of the uncertainty? Now, allow me to introduce our first guest. Her name is Natasha. Natasha is a Russian origin and Switzerland-based. And she's a Dutch citizen whose professional career spans the world of communication, public relations, crisis management, and music, and educational support and mentoring. And of course, our second guest that if you follow our show that you have seen her before is Tatsiana. And Tatsiana is a certified public speaking coach, and she has the 6 years of coaching experiences, and also she's the founder of the Speaking Hub. So without further ado, ladies, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Will, for having us.
No problem. The pleasure is all mine. Now, I want to start with Natasha. You know, today, as I mentioned in the intro, I guess we can't just say because the pandemic that help us to re-understand or redefine the word crisis. I think that throughout life that we all experience ups and downs and difficulties and, challenges. But again, fast forward, we're looking at the year 2022. From your perspective, how should we define the word crisis today?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think today we learned one thing. Crisis could happen anytime and impact anyone. And often, unfortunately, we don't have any ideas when it's coming, right? But I think what we have learned, and I've learned through my years of experience and what we've learned during the pandemic and current situation that is happening in Europe, there is one fundamental thing about all crises. We don't get to choose a crisis, but we get to decide how to respond to it, right? And that means we get to decide how do we set our mind, what do we do about it? Do we embrace the crisis? Do we deny it? What steps we're going to take? And to your question, crisis is just anything really that breaks the status quo, the situation, the environment we are in, and forces us really to change. And the change could be both. It could be positive and negative, right? And it's part of our life. But I think what is most important is really what are we going to do with that change and how we're going to embrace it. The reason I'm saying how we're going to embrace it, because I think it's important that you are going to embrace it as opposed to fight it, deny it, or run away from it. Because again, it's part of life and you cannot just continue running away if you want to live your life. So yeah, crisis is really anything that affects us in our daily life. And the recent world events have shown us that it's just about anything. Military conflict, pandemic, natural disaster, job loss, financial crisis, loss of a family member, pretty much anything that really forces us to change and breaks the status quo.
Tatsiana, I want to ask the next question to you. Again, you are the expert on communication. Too often, I guess, start with the word friendship. And people always say, when a person is facing difficulties, or, as Natasha mentioned, can be anything. Too often, you always say it's so much easier to find comfort and so much easier to find advice or wisdoms from others, who might went through the same process, so able to share some feedback with us. But on the other side, communication is not just about communicating with others so that we can feel better. But on the other hand, communication is also about talking to ourselves. And I know that you are the speaking coach. Can you help us to understand what does that mean in the midst of the crisis that we learn to communicate with ourselves? What does that mean in terms of communicative skills?
Thank you all for your question. It's a beautiful question. I love it so much. So, of course, communication is usually a lot of people think that this is a conversation between two or many people, right? But we do also need to know how to communicate with ourselves, how to carry ourselves through this crisis, right? So, what I really love to say when I talk about communication is that it is all about feelings. So, if we talk to others, it's how we make others feel and how do they feel after by the end of the conversation, right? And when we talk to ourselves, it's also the ability to realize our own feelings. And I think that in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of uncertainty, a lot of people struggle because they are ruled by the emotions, which should be actually otherwise. They should be the rulers over their emotions, but they are allow themselves to be influenced by these emotions, and this is where the problem begins. So if we are talking about communication with ourselves, this is absolutely about realizing, acknowledging, and accepting our own emotions and knowing how to have a conversation with the emotions.
Natasha, I want to ask the next question to you. Again, I know that you travel internationally and that you have experience of managing and dealing with, all kinds of crises, and also you're helping people to understand that. But correct me if I'm wrong, and again, Tatsiana, you're welcome to chime in as well. I think today that when we look at the world today, and not just about the pandemic, but everything going on, people tend to exaggerate what they are suffering today. So in other words, we at the beginning, let's say hypothetically, without the pandemic, everything seemed insignificant. But because what the pandemic happened, and because the whole world was being challenged at the same time, we tend to exaggerate our emotion, and we tend to exaggerate our reaction. So in other words, in the midst of the whole crisis, we are doubling our own jeopardy, where we are putting more pressure onto us. Natasha, the question to you is, why are we doing this? Or in other words, since when that we learn how to do this? I mean, don't you think that we're supposed to reduce the tension, not to double it?
I think it's the right way to say we should reduce the tension, but we're human beings. We are hardwired to some extent to get emotional, as Tiana said, right? And to respond to stress in certain ways. And you cannot do anything about it. That goes back to millions and millions of years ago, how our predecessors, how they responded to stress in their primitive way of living. So when a stress happens, and again, stress could be both positive and negative, but when it happens and impacts us, we would have typically three main reactions. We either fight, right, or we flight, or we freeze. And when it happens, our amygdala gets hijacked, and then tons of different reactions happens to our brain. Sometimes our neurons stop firing, and then again causes certain reactions. we either freeze and we don't know how to respond, or we're going to fight. And when we're going to fight, we're just going to charge all our emotions and everything what we have. But what I often say, when such situation happens, when stress happens, and it's inevitable, right? It happens in our daily lives. But when a big stress happens, obviously each of us is going to have a personal reaction to it. And first of all, it's going to be emotional reaction. And it depends who you are, how you've been trained, what life you've had before, your mental state, your knowledge about yourself, your emotional intelligence. You're going to have a certain response to it. And what I would always say, when the stress happens, do not fight your brain at first. Let it shut down, because typically our brain does shut down temporarily, and it's real because of the chemical reactions that happen in our brain. So I would say, let your brain shut down. If your brain panics, let it get panic. Close yourself up in a room, panic, scream, throw your emotions out, talk to your emotions, and acknowledge, as Tatsiana said. Exactly, acknowledge your emotions, recognize it, because it's a really important part of your life. Label your emotions, whether it's fear, whether it's anger, whether it's frustration. Acknowledge it, because also there are lots of studies show that if you just acknowledge your emotions, a state of mind, in that particular moment, it will also help you to calm down yourself and disconnect your cognizance from your emotions. And what happens then, your brain is getting ready to assess the situation and make more conscious decisions and choices that will be right for you. But if we miss that step, if we start panicking, getting frustrated, and just get wrapped up about it and keep ruminating about it, that's not going to be helpful to anyone. And then we get angry, and then what happens? Our brain doesn't have a space. And it's not in the right mindset to make any conscious decisions and decide, this is a stress moment, this is a crisis. Here's my plan of actions, here's what I'm going to do. So, I think in ideal world, you should be diminishing your emotional reactions, but you can only do it once you acknowledge it, once you talk to it, once you friend it, if you like.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tatsiana.
And then move forward.
I couldn't agree more, Natasha. You just framed it so beautifully. And I just wanted to add a little bit about this emotional agility that Susan David, a famous psychologist, was talking about. That it's all about recognizing your emotions and seeing what they are. And then what Natasha said, you need to label them. And the thing here is that you need to label them correctly. So very often we would just say, okay, I'm frustrated or I'm anxious, right? But that is not precise enough. So it is great to really sit down and dig deeper into your emotions, dive deeper and see what's really going on in there. What kind of name can I give to it? And what I think about it is that a lot of negative emotions, they are also kind of like, because we do not label them correctly, they look to us like strangers or something unknown. And we know that people are afraid of unknown. And going back to your question, Will, that you say that people tend to double these reactions, right? And to overreact to things.
That's right.
I think this happens because we do not really understand the precise emotions that are happening inside of us. And that's why it gets so blown out of proportions. So the most important thing is to sit down, to acknowledge your emotion, to give it the correct label. And as soon as you do that, as Natasha said, you would be just so much better. You will feel so much better because you know what you're facing, because now there is less uncertainty about your inner emotions, and it will help you to carry through these uncertain times.
It's interesting that, ladies, when you are talking about that, I guess the simple way for us to understand is when we are going through emotions, it doesn't matter that we are going to the mountaintop or going to the down a valley. It's so important that we need to, number one, acknowledge that we are being frustrated and we are being sad and we are being challenged. But on the other hand, again, seeking comfort from others is one way. But on the other hand is we also need to find a way to let out, to unleash the emotion. But let me challenge you with one more step. We are looking at the younger generations today. Ladies, trust me. We always say the younger generations today, they are the backbones of the country, and we are placing greater hopes on them. But I can testify many times that you have no idea how many times that people are coming to me to say, today's younger generations across the continent are so afraid of difficulties, are so afraid of shouldering responsibilities, and let alone dealing with crisis. I mean, Natasha, I want to ask you the question first. Again, what happened to the younger generations today? Is it just because, again, the pandemic? Is it just because the luxurious lifestyle we have, so that we're more vulnerable to challenges, or any other reasons that younger generations today are not prepared to dealing with crisis, not only in their own life, but also the world outside their lives? What is your take on that? Help us to understand.
So I have a couple of answers to that. First of all, I think none of us is really prepared to respond to a crisis, right? We don't grow up with a manual and training by our parents or at school how to deal with the crisis. What are you going to do when a crisis happens? When I go and train executives, sometimes it's the first time ever in their mid-50s they would see that or understand that. So that's, I think, number one. We learn it by doing, by living through it. And if you are interested, you might start teaching your kids or preparing your kids. But nobody's really giving us that manual, right? Would you agree to that? There is not really a manual. If crisis happens once in your life, here's what are you going to do? So that's number one, I think. We learn it in our lifetime. And I think we learn a lot about it when we go to the business world. And number two, I would disagree to some extent about younger generation. And I think it really depends probably who you compare to. Maybe younger generation in China is slightly different than the younger generation in other continents. But my personal observation is about the current military conflict in Europe, where I have seen many young Ukrainians not being afraid and standing up for their freedom, for their values, for everything what they value in life. And I think there is a great learning for all of us. And some of my friends even joke, like, we don't need to do any training. We just have to bring those young kids and share with us how did they do and how they're doing. They don't have any fear. They don't have any manual, really. They just go and they do what they think is right for them. But that's probably an extreme, because there are also countries and places in the world where the younger generation is in a more comfortable environment, where things have been given to them, sometimes on a golden plate, and they've been protected. So I guess it's already a threefold answer to your question, why is it happening? But I think the fundamental thing, what I believe is, we don't get to learn that at school. We don't get to learn it from our families typically. It's a life journey. Having said that, I think we all would benefit from it if we start learning. First of all, learning your personal response to it. And your emotional response, as Tatsiana was saying.
Tatsiana, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with Natasha that a lot of things we learn through while we're going through life. And I would just like to add to that for a crisis, and Natasha would agree with me, of course, that communication is extremely important, right? The way you deal with crisis. And you can learn communication skills. It's something that you can learn, right? It's something that you can also practice. And I think especially during a younger age, when people are interacting with their peers, peers in school, or in some extracurricular activities, they can always improve and enhance their communication skills. And this is something that might help them further in life when they're dealing with a crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah, very good point, Jana.
Ladies, as we are talking about the younger generations, and I have to bring another topic coming in, it's called social media. And we know that today social media plays a significant role. I mean, again, not just because Facebook changed their name to Metaverse or simply Elon Musk purchased the entire Twitter. I mean, if we go down that road, this conversation is going to be 12 hours long. But let's talk about people tend to find like-minded people on social media platforms. And again, I have encountered multiple different groups that people are sharing ideas and opinions in the midst of different difficulties or uncertainties and, of course, crisis. But on the other hand, people tend to say that social media today provide another significant aspect to us, which is the word identity. And I want to go back to that one, is in the midst of the crisis, Natasha and Tatsiana, to both of you, how should we understand the word identity? So in other words, because again, as you mentioned before, both ladies, it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to deal with emotional journey or emotional trauma. But identity, it's still something that rather significant to all of us. So in other words, when we are hanging out with people over social media, or when we are dealing with trying to find like-minded people over social media, do you think that that's very helpful to help us to continue to be truthful to who we are, even though it's it's a virtual world? Or it's rather much better that we see each other in person and holding hands together to go through this crisis, go through these difficulties in person or hand in hand? Let's start with Tatsiana. What do you think?
Yeah, I think a very deep question, right? So I think that it's very multi-layered and multifaceted, the way we communicate, especially online. Yes, on the one hand, we can lose our identity, or we can do that on purpose, right? We want to be someone else when we're online. But on the other hand, this is a way to really show up who we are and be authentic. And this whole idea about vulnerability and authenticity has been so popular recently. So I would say that online world and media, it has these two sides to it, right? But I would just like to underscore that whatever we do, we want to bring some good into the world, and we want to have a good impact. And especially during the times of uncertainty, some people would say, okay, I don't know what's going to happen next. But the thing is that what is going to happen next totally depends on us. So it's us who can take the steps and do something about creating this future that we crave for. And so I think we should not be losing our identity, but we should be trying to maintain it so that we can build something bigger even through this online world. And in terms of pandemic right now, in terms of lockdown, when we cannot leave our houses, I think online world is actually a bliss for everyone, because we can stay connected, we can keep inspiring each other, and we can keep showing who we truly are to the world, even though we cannot leave our buildings or our apartments. So I would say that keeping an identity would be the priority for everyone, and not trying to hide ourselves behind this online virtual world, this wall that could be so misleading to others.
Natasha, what do you think?
So I would always vow for authenticity, transparency in any situation in life, and especially in crisis management. That probably would be my golden rule number one. Stay authentic, be transparent, honest, and humble. And we also know from experience that, first of all, you cannot know everything in life. And sometimes admitting certain things, admitting that you don't know, or admitting that you're going through challenging times. And I think that's really echoing what Tatsiana said, would help you to get through difficult situation, and would also help you to get more trust and credibility from your peers or friends, stakeholders, partners, whoever you choose. As Tatsiana said, being authentic and vulnerable, and I'm glad it's becoming more almost like a trend within personal or business world, and it's definitely a trend that I would say we need to embrace further to get through, especially challenging situation. And what I would also add to that is that I think the collective power of going either through crisis or change or stress or grieving is extremely strong. And many psychological studies also show the power of it, that it will help you to get through the change and challenge and emerge even stronger with the help of others. And I think also it goes back to who we are as human beings, being surrounded by other people and being true to ourselves. I think it should remain at the core of everything what we do.